Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Partners in Diversity's Breakfast for Champions. My name is Tracy Lamb. I'm the Director of Programs and Communications at Partners in Diversity. Thank you so much for being here with us this morning. I'm really excited about today's speaker and have been looking forward to meeting her and hearing from her for quite some time. First, I want to give you a few housekeeping items. For logistical reasons, the chat box has been deactivated. However, there will be time at the end for Q&A with our speaker, so please use the Q&A box to post your questions at any time. And this session is being recorded, and we'll send that out to attendees a little bit after the event. And also a logistical note, this event is being live captioned. To activate that feature, hover over to the bottom of your screen for the menu bar and select the CC icon. And also a few programming notes. Coming up on March 10th, we have another Breakfast for Champions. This one is on a unique approach called targeted universalism. And some people are calling this the Equity 2.0. And it'll feature Professor John Powell from UC Berkeley. He'll be there to guide us through this discussion. Then on April 20th, we have another Breakfast for Champions, this one focusing on bystander training. It is a topic that many of our attendees have requested, and it should be a very hands-on and interactive session. So don't miss out on these learning opportunities. Registration links are being posted in the chat box, and we'll also follow up with that in an email. Finally, save the date for our first Northwest Equity Summit. It takes place on May 4th and 5th in the virtual space, of course. It'll be 2 half days of insights from top business and diversity, equity, inclusion leaders, as well as a workshop with diversity trainers from all over the world. Tickets go on sale March 3rd, so keep an eye out in your inbox for details next week. In the meantime, sponsorship opportunities are available. It's a great way to showcase your organization's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Visit our website or email us to learn more about the sponsorship opportunities. Thanks again for being here. Now I would like to introduce you to the Executive Director of Partners in Diversity, Mari Watanabe. Mari?
Hey, thanks, Tracy. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here this morning. Breakfast for Champions is one of our key educational programs offered as a benefit to our members. And since the pandemic, we've been hosting these once a month to help further your learnings on top issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you know of an organization that is interested in enhancing their knowledge of DEI by attending our programs, please encourage them to become members. Your support allows us to bring in great speakers like today's. In just a few short years, she changed the culture of her organization for the better, and I know we'll learn a lot from her today. But first, I want to get a sense of who is in the room this morning with 2 quick questions. So there's going to be a poll. So how many people do you supervise or manage? And the second question is, in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, where is your organization overall today compared to a year ago? Where is your organization today? So we'll just take a moment and let everybody fill in the poll. I guess it's going to rain today, huh? I hope you guys all got out yesterday. I walked around yesterday. Oh, wow, it was so nice out. Okay, we are almost done. Just a few more. Okay, Tracy, why don't you go ahead and, yeah. So the results of how many people do you supervise or manage? 49% of you manage 1 to 10, 10% of you 11 to 30, 6% 31 to 50, 6% 51 plus. Wow, that's a lot of people. And 29% of you don't supervise or manage anybody. And the second question is, Compared to a year ago, my organization has made advances in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So 59% of you said I agree and 24% strongly agree. So that's fantastic. Love seeing those statistics. And those of you who are still, you don't feel, so hopefully some of our programming will help you integrate that into your organizations. So this is important information because since the beginning of the pandemic and since the murder of George Floyd, many organizations are making more concerted efforts to increase DE&I in the workplace. So last summer, Partners in Diversity released a diversity retention study that was supported by Portland General Electric and the Oregon Community Foundation. It showed that only 17% of those surveyed agreed that their organization was supportive, 70% reported tokenism at work, and 74% reported some form of discrimination at work. These are very sobering numbers. And the central theme that connected these experiences was a perceived lack of accountability among leaders and the lack of support from the organization. According to our study, these experiences, perceptions, and attitudes often resulted in feelings of organizational injustice, alienation, disengagement from work, low job satisfaction, fatigue, and often withdrawal from the job and the region. What can we do to improve these numbers and to change the experiences? Having diverse leadership is one step toward a company culture where everyone feels included, heard, and respected. That's what we'll explore today. To lead us in a fireside chat with our speaker is Dr. Allison Davis White-Eyes. Dr. Davis White-Eyes serves as the Director of Community Diversity Relations at Oregon State University. Under her leadership, student diversity efforts were reorganized and expanded to include 7 cultural resource centers, as well as an intersectional, multimodal student learning and engagement programming. Prior to OSU, Dr. Davis White-Eyes served as the University of Oregon as Assistant Director of Admissions, Special Assistant to the President on Native American Affairs. So please join me in welcoming a friend of Partners in Diversity and true champion of equity and inclusion, Dr. Allison Davis White-Eyes. Allison?
Thank you so much, Mari. That was a very lovely introduction, and I am so excited to be here with all of you this morning. I'm pleased to be here to serve as your moderator for what will be an eye-opening fireside chat with our guest of honor today, Lisa Wardell. It is so exciting to have the opportunity to learn from the many talented individuals who are committed to making a difference. After the fireside chat with Lisa, we will take questions from the audience, so please add your questions to the Q&A box. Now, I would like to introduce our distinguished guest. Lisa Wardell is the chairperson and CEO of Adtalem Global Education. Adtalem is a leading workforce solutions provider and is a for-profit educational company that offers professional, undergraduate, and graduate degrees. Lisa is the only African-American female chairperson and CEO in the Standard & Poor's 400 Index. Since she became the CEO in 2016 and the chairperson in 2019, she has successfully acquired and integrated companies into Adtalem's financial services verticals. Under her leadership, stock prices tripled, and more importantly for us this morning, gender and ethnic diversity has increased at the Adtalem board to 62% and to 78% within its senior leadership. Today, we are going to learn about the intentional practices and actions that she took to accomplish that. And hopefully, you will be able to translate and apply all of this wisdom into your own workplaces. Welcome, Lisa. Thank you for being here. So,
thank you so much.
Let's begin with a big question. You are one of only 2 Black female CEOs in a major company. I think Walgreens just recently hired Rosalind Brewer. So do you think you can share with us how you rose to the top as a Black woman and mother of 6?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dr. Davis White Eyes. So, yeah, first I would say that this statistic is unfortunately pretty consistent, and it has to do with some of the things that we need to do internally in organizations in order to provide people with the just exposure that they need, and combine that with a board that is diverse, because boards are those folks who actually choose CEOs. For me, I was very fortunate early on in my career to get some of the experiences and exposure that allowed me to come into the CEO role. And so for this audience, let me just say what I think a couple of those are. The first is being able to have a job or a career within your organization where you're able to facilitate and negotiate and lead teams and groups. You don't necessarily have to be the supervisor of lots of people, but being able to influence others in a way that's very factual and provides the organization with a level of expertise and know-how in your particular area. You really determine what is it that you're good at. For me, that was finances and audit and kind of the numbers, but it can really be in a number of different areas. And then the second is getting that operational experience. We hear about it a lot in different organizations called the P&L experience. Have you been a general manager? Have you been responsible for the top and bottom line? And what organizations are finding now, certainly in my organization, it's true, and that's why my management team is much more diverse, is that our management teams and our leaders really need to be able to reflect the communities that we serve. For Adtalem Global Education, Adtalem meaning to empower in Latin, we are providing education access to communities and students who would not necessarily have access. So working adults, parents, folks whose life gets in the way. And so we need people on our team and on our board who understand that lens.
That's very helpful to hear about your board and how you have charged them and that they've made a difference in the work that Adtalem produces. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about Black CEOs just rising up in organizations. Why do you think that there are so few Black CEOs, and what can be done about that?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of reasons. One is that a lot of the channels to CEO, once you've done some of those things I just talked about, the operational experience, obviously the credentials, being able to work in teams, those things that all of us learn in a professional setting. Part of the problem is that actually both for Blacks and just from a gender perspective too, for women, a lot of the exposure and channels are sort of outside of that boardroom or that management room. And so it's very relationship focused. And what we have to do as Blacks in leadership, as women in leadership, is make sure that we're leveling that playing field, so to speak, for people of color and for women to be able to get those roles. The first thing is just sort of this notion of why not, right? Because what you'll find in a lot of different organizations, including Adtalem when I first came in as CEO in 2016, is not that there was that there was any thought that a Black person could not get the promotion and become the business unit leader, et cetera. It's just that they were folks who were making the decision were more comfortable with someone they had worked with before who may not have been Black and brown. And so the question, and my team will tell you that I would ask all the time is, well, why not this other person? It doesn't mean, you got 2 or 3 qualified people. Why wouldn't we? And when you peel back the onion, it's really because, hey, we don't know them in a social setting, or hey, we're not quite sure, where they've been and what they've done. We have not spent that time. And so part of it has been spending that time to see through another's lens so that you're comfortable that they're able to do the job. Obviously, it's got to be people who have the experience and can do the job, but there are plenty of Black people who can do that, of course.
Yes, we often hear, in recruitment that it's so difficult to find diverse talent, right?
Yes.
And I think that you're sort of sharing with us some of the recipes to success to finding that diverse talent. I
Yeah.
think,
Sorry, go ahead, please.
so would you like to say more about that?
Yeah, I was going to say there's two pieces to that. I think in terms of management teams and inside the company, what we have done as a team and what I have mandated is two things. One, we tie our compensation and our our compensation, our short-term compensation, to whether managers are really either hiring externally, whether they're having diverse slates and diverse candidates and pushing their executive recruiters to give them a diverse slate. There's not a quota of this is how many diverse people you need to hire, but certainly you need to make sure that you're looking at a diverse pool. So that's one. And then secondly, internally, our greatest strength and ability to get diverse management teams at the executive level, or in the case of an institution at the top academic and faculty level, is development within. And so we also make sure that we are compensating our managers and leaders based on the developmental opportunities that they are providing for their current employees who are looking to be promoted and establish a career path. So it's a management side. From a board perspective, people ask me all the time, how did you get, a majority diverse board, meaning gender and ethnicity? There are three Black people on the board, three Black in addition to me, so four. And the answer to that, particularly as it relates to women, is quite simple. There is one requirement that really across certainly the Fortune 500, if not the Fortune 1000, prevents women, and that is you must have prior public board experience. Well, that's a little silly, right? Because there are not a lot of women that have prior public board experience. If they do, they're on a public board or two already. So what I did was I found up to now, we've had 4 women who were not on a public board who are absolutely fantastic contributors to our board. And I interviewed them and I put them on their first public board. And guess what? Now they get all sorts of calls for public boards because they're great executives. One of them ran a P&L literally for a major global company, multinational. Donna Reineck, she runs a unit at the Royal Caribbean that is larger than our entire organization. But because she had not been on a public board, this was her first opportunity. That's just nonsense. And we need to call companies to task on that, because what they're missing in terms of the expertise is phenomenal. And so that's really my big push as it relates to diversity on the board.
This is very exciting. And as I listen to you speak, I'm thinking about how is it that we can change some of the structures that have disallowed people to, for instance, participate on boards or to advance or to diversify businesses and organizations. What would you say are some of the white supremacy structures that you experienced and had to overcome? Were there any that you had to go along with in order to survive?
Yeah, look, I think in general, we all sort of go along because we do have this systemic structure. The question is, are we aware enough to understand that that's what we're doing? And I will be very honest and say early on in my career, probably I didn't have that sense of awareness. And I don't mean, sort of, when this became a national dialogue a year ago. I mean, sort of, a couple decades ago. But then as I began to understand how decisions are really made and that structural piece of it, it allowed me to sort of challenge and push back a little bit. So I'll give a couple of examples and see if that's answering your question. So the first, in terms of our actual business, which again is education. So it's medical and healthcare and financial services education. We have the largest nursing school in the country. We produce nurses, which obviously during this time of pandemic, but in general, the healthcare inequities are just, so dire. It is a place of great demand, and it's a great social mission for our company. But when we think about that and the structure, particularly in academia in and around healthcare and healthcare education, very structured towards the white male physician, very structured towards one care fits all. And so recognizing that and then putting this level of culturally sensitive care in and around the communities through our nursing schools and medical schools allows us to sort of combat that systemic racism, right? And we're then able to use data, which is so important for our communities and our diversity initiatives. We're then able to use data to prove that culturally sensitive care prevents or provides better outcomes for patients. Because at the end of the day, that is what hospital systems and insurance companies, the payer system, that's what they all want. So that's one example. I would say sitting in the CEO role, one place that I think people don't necessarily have a good sense of just how structurally homogenic the system is in the investment community. And so I have been in early on sort of intro investment meetings where people have said to me, men have said to me, how did you get this job? How did you find yourself in this role? What's a girl like you doing in this job? I've told these questions and people are just amazed. And you can do one of two things, every once in a while I do give the, okay, I'm not usually speechless, but I'm speechless only for a few seconds. But what you say is, well, I'm doing the exact same thing that a young man would do in my situation. And that's making sure that I make plan and get my operating profit and have fabulous student outcomes. And, you sort of go with the punches. But I think every time that happens, I like to think or hope that it is helping someone else learn just a different lens. But it is very much a part of the investment community where we operate. And that's why it's so important for the larger investors that control investments, BlackRock and State Street and others, that they really stand up for diversity. And you're seeing that dialogue. They're demanding diversity, both on the boards as well as in the management teams that serve those institutions.
It sounds like you're breaking barriers in many different areas, and it's refreshing to hear that. It's inspiring to hear that. And we know that there are still many challenges ahead. So we know that things don't end with hiring diverse talent and getting them through the door. Can you talk about the ways in which you retain diverse talent and create an environment of inclusion and belonging?
I'm so glad you said that, because that is so key to this whole debate. And I sometimes get quite concerned that we have such a push right now on diversity in terms of, which is great, coming into the organizations. People really aren't understanding what that means in terms of that sense of belonging once you're there. Right. And so it's interesting. My company is on a journey. I'm sure many of the listeners today are too. To that point, 3 years ago, I kept saying to people, stop calling it diversity and inclusion. When we have someone to include, when we have a group to include, we can start talking about that. Let's talk about diversity right now. Obviously, we've come a long way, and our numbers prove that. And now it's all about, are we driving the open dialogue and the transparency and the authenticity for people to be able to express their own opinions? And from that perspective, I think it absolutely has to come from the top. And I'll give you an example. As with many organizations, the George Floyd tragedy and those that followed shortly thereafter really changed the dialogue right within the corporate and the academic setting certainly across the nation, if not the globe. And to my recollection, it's the first time that people were using the words black and white racism and those types of things versus the more important but inclusive and softer diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that what that has done if you are willing to really make sure that all all viewpoints are taken into account and you're really brave about that, it can start a dialogue that is, I'm seeing it, that it's different from the last couple of decades. I'll give you an example. We did a town hall, and as often with diversity, there's so many things we have to think about, right? LGBTQI, Latinx, also same-sex parents, there's all of these things, but I really made sure that I said, this does not mean that I don't think that any other diversity matters. What it means is today we're having a conversation about Black and white and racism, and just having that sort of put out there helps people to take a breath and say, we can actually have this dialogue. But it's hard, right? It's not a dialogue that comes easy. And I think from that, it gives people the permission to speak their own views. And the other thing that I did, I, as you can imagine, I've got, I don't know, 10,000 or so employees. So I got hundreds of emails. And I got a couple of emails saying, well, I disagree with what you're doing. My husband is a police officer. He's a white police officer. He risks his life every day, and all he gets is, crap back from this community on this issue. And I really took those emails really seriously. I shared them with my entire group. I don't mean that person was not anonymous. I don't mean I called them out on a big town hall, but I said, those are the brave emails, right? It's easy to say, yes, I agree. We should be inclusive and we should not be racist. And in fact, we should be anti-racist because you have a Black CEO out there. But people who are willing to say, here's why I'm having trouble understanding your viewpoint. And then I can say to them, hey, why don't you read White Fragility, or why don't you watch 13 on Netflix, and then tell me like what you got from it, and let's have that dialogue. That's like a really brave thing to do. And I think if anything, the D&I conversations over the last 12 to 8 months have just demonstrated bravery in places that I might not have expected it before. And that's what gives me optimism.
And it sounds as though these changes have contributed to the retention of diverse talent in your
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. You were asking me that. Yes, so we have very formal programs for retention of talent. Ours is called Catalyst, but basically tracking people as they're coming in, because you're always hiring like really bright, quick study, folks that have the skill set, or can build the skill set. And we do two things. We put them through a formal program, which primarily focuses on both exposure, so exposure to board members and management team members and our bankers and lawyers, folks that they may not see at the more junior level, and helping them understand who those people are. And then also, top communication and presentation, and being able to carry an idea or a thought in a room. Because at the end of the day, there is a shift between skill sets and having skill sets and being able to do a job, whether it's marketing or legal or anything, operational effectiveness. And then when you get to a certain level, what becomes much more important is, one, your ability to communicate either in person, as we are now on Zoom, or oral communication is paramount. And then two, your ability to be grounded enough in yourself and feel like you belong. I use the words belong in the room enough yourself to be an influencer. And those two things have to be taught. Some people obviously are natural communicators, but have to be taught if you want to take a group or a person from one level, let's say middle management level, to the more senior levels. You can't expect them to pick that up on their own. And I think that's where we focus as it relates to development of talent once they're in the door.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I'm hearing you talk about the importance of the sense of belonging and mattering in an organization. And I think I agree that is really critical to the retention of individuals. And I also hear about having open dialogue, transparency, authenticity in engaging your employees. Very, very important. And I think that organizations are trying to move in that direction. Some do it better than others. Some of it is happening in fits and starts. But I think one of the critical pieces that you sort of touched on was the onboarding of the new employee, which then leads to the retention, because the onboarding sort of sets the tone, right? The culture of the organization. And you mentioned what I would, if I'm paraphrasing correctly, a sort of horizontal onboarding, where you talked about bringing in new people and having them meet with senior leaders, people that are peers, and so on. So I'm kind of curious what your opinion is about the concept of shared governance in an organization. Does that work? Or do you have a very different special secret sauce about how you engage your employees and members of your Adtalem community?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure how much of a secret sauce it is, but what I would say is, well, one of the first things that you said, which is some organizations are doing this in fits and starts. What I would say to you is it is really important as an organization, certainly as a leader, but as an organization, to also acknowledge when you've made a mistake or when something hasn't worked, right? So one of the things that we're pretty good at is, try, test, and revise, right? So when you say, is there room for, I guess we would use the word matrix. We do have a lot of matrix leadership. That's not easy, right? When you then have lots of different opinions, and sometimes we have to back up and say, hey, it this didn't work, or it didn't work as well as we'd like, and so we're going to try it differently. And I think having an organization that is nimble enough to do that allows you some of this test and learn as it relates to diversity. We always do have our core values are teach, teamwork, energy, accountability, community, and heart. Everyone at Adtalem knows those. It's not just something written on the conference room wall. But the tough part is then taking that and saying, what does that mean as it relates to this really, really difficult diversity conversation, right? So if you take accountability, am I accountable for every single person on my team? Does Dr. Davis White Eyes feel like she is a part of this team and that her opinion matters just as much as mine, or Jack's or Sally's or whoever else is on the team, that manager, that leader is accountable for that?
That is very powerful. I'm curious, as you think about recruiting talent, what are some of the specific mindsets that you look for that help you in changing and fulfilling your goals for the organization? What are some of, I guess a better way to say this is, we're in the 21st century. We're in this COVID moment. We're in the George Floyd moment. Has that shifted your view on the kind of mindset that needs to be in the CEO realm and also in various business and industry organizations?
I would say it hasn't shifted it, but it has demonstrated that those things that I look for really are the right things. So in that way, it makes me feel good. And so I would have answered this question the same way 2 years ago, 3 years ago that I am today. So what I look for when I'm hiring for my team, or when someone comes and says, should I hire this person, et cetera, is a couple of things. One is resiliency. And so, I mean, this pandemic, right, is certainly a test to all of us there. And when I mean resiliency, I don't mean let's get people who from the outside can act like nothing is going on. As I tell my organization all the time, if you're not thinking about your mental health right now, a year into this pandemic, you should be concerned about that, not the other way around. Like, it's perfectly okay as you're homeschooling and juggling and taking care of your elder parents that you can't actually see and haven't seen for a year. It's okay not to feel okay, right? So by resilience, I mean taking stock of where you are and saying, okay, what does that mean for my role? And I would have said that, like I said, pre-pandemic, but this has really demonstrated that. The second is learning agility. So to your point, all of those things are changing, but also, the digital economy and acceleration of that, particularly through the economy, through the pandemic, is changing. Diversity and inclusion and how we think about that and how we define that is changing, and our responsibilities. And so that ability to continue to learn, I mean, I've probably read, I don't know, 18 books on diversity, racism, anti-racism, implicit bias, all of those things, just in the last year, as we've been thinking through what's the best way to have these conversations. So resiliency, learning agility. And then the third is really empathy. And I use the word empathy in and around, I mean, we have a social mission, so that folks who work for us believe that education changes lives, et cetera. But across any organization, what I mean by empathy is, does this person have the ability to look through somebody else's lens, doesn't have to agree, but understand why it is that they believe or think what they believe. Because in general, it's not this need to change people's beliefs. It's this need to provide an ecosystem where that works. I mean, there's certainly some things where there's a bright line, and what I'm absolutely willing to go out there and say what that is. But there's many other places where we just need to be able to listen. So it's resilience, it's learning agility, and it's empathy, obviously on top of, can they do the job?
Thank you so much for that. As I'm thinking about the role of CEOs in trying to build that sort of culture, we know that from time to time there's external disruptions, national crises, national events. We did mention the pandemic earlier. We talked about George Floyd, but I want to take a deeper dive in that. What advice would you give for CEOs and executives when an event like George Floyd happens? We see a lot of money being thrown at different organizations that deal with diversity, some that don't deal with diversity, but are now putting that as part of their claim, right? Yes. And I guess the question becomes, well, what should top leaders do internally when these national crises raise glaring social issues?
Yeah, so a couple things. First of all, I think that it really was the George Floyd moment that shifted the dynamic for CEOs are no longer can remain silent, period. I don't care what industry, how big the company is. There were times when certain CEOs would speak up, certain wouldn't. Those days are gone. And so being in an environment where you speak up makes sense. And just has to be. But to your point, I mean, I think that's why, as you think about Partners in Diversity, right, you've been doing this since 2005, right? And so part of the challenge now is making sure that people understand the journey that organizations have been on, organizations like this. Adtalem is at a great advantage because when this happened, we didn't say, oh, let's go find someone to be on our board. For decades, we have been talking about and acting on this need for our board and our management team to represent the communities we serve. And so what I do encourage CEOs who are now sort of really struggling with this is the first year, let's say, for many CEOs to think about this in a different way, and just frankly a far more it's just top of mind. It's the boardroom conversation. I encourage them to talk to and work with those organizations that have been understanding these issues, for decades and not months. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with somebody new coming and saying, hey, I care about this too. But I think that's the challenge we have as we go into and continue out this calendar year, is making sure that we're not recreating the wheel. Some of the things that you all have been doing and trying to do, like I said, for decades, what we've been doing in terms of, predictive learning for Black people and brown people and people in communities that don't have the wraparound services, we've been doing for decades. And those are the stories that we have to get out, frankly, to Washington, into the business community. And I would say for the first time, certainly since I've been in my CEO role, they are much more willing to listen as a group than before. So it's a good opportunity for us.
You sound very optimistic about the future. And you sound as though there's change afoot in major industries and with CEOs as a result of recent national events.
Yes. So I will tell you, I'm an eternal optimist. So I'll start with that. I get that from my dad. But what I try to do is balance. So I don't want anyone to think that I come to this. I am until Roz becomes the CEO of Walgreens. I am the only Black woman CEO. You can use any index, S&P 400, Fortune 1000, Fortune 5. You can use whichever one you want. And whenever people ask me about that statistics, I say it's shameful. It's great because I'm a first generation college grad. So that's kind of neat. But it's shameful, right? And so I don't mean to suggest that I don't understand that. I mean, right before, so the last conference, in-person conference, so call it a year and a half ago that I went to, I was talking to a CEO of at least Fortune 200, if not Fortune 100. This is before George Floyd, but diversity already a topic. He said, I'd like you to be on my board. I said, I can't be on your board because I'm on a public board. I'm on the board of Lowe's Home Improvement. And he said, well, okay, then I need you to introduce me to the other Black female CEOs of public companies because I need a sitting CEO of a public company. And I would really, really like it to be a Black woman. I said, well, you're looking at it. There are no others. And he literally, we were having a face-to-face conversation, not even Zoom. And he said, you're lying. And I said, well, typically, I do not tell lies in meetings with Fortune 200 CEOs who are asking me a favor. So actually, I'm not lying, but perhaps I could introduce you some people who are not sitting CEOs, but who are very qualified. But the story, it's not lost on me that people just do not understand the dire nature of this, other than people within in and around our communities. And so it is just a responsibility, one, for me to be optimistic. One other quick story on that. I was on some network on diversity, and it was diverse people on the call, and they said, well, some of us are just tired of telling this story and helping people understand. And I said, I am not willing to be part of that conversation. We are in too important of a position to just say, well, I'm tired of explaining to white people what it is to be Black, and you just can't be that. If you're going to be that, you have to go do something else. Because it's not fair to our communities to do that. So I'm optimistic, but I'm also very a stickler about what our responsibility is, because we sit in these seats in your case, in academia, which I can't imagine a more difficult place from a diversity perspective, and for me in corporate America.
Yes, and it's about change and responsibility. Thank you for echoing those words. I think too that we live in a time where, and I know we're all aware of this, where there's a lot of political division. And because of all the massive change, there's a lot of reconceptualizing, right? What diversity, equity, and inclusion really is. And sometimes I think we get bogged down in language, but language yet and still is very important. One of the things that CEOs and others, and I can certainly speak for higher education, that we are challenged with is the dialogue around acronyms like POC, BIPOC, Black versus African American, or Latino versus Latinx. So a lot of leaders are very uncomfortable and oftentimes afraid to use the wrong descriptor.
Yes.
How do you handle this in a global organization? How do you move with language? How do you change with language in a global organization where I imagine you are talking to a very wide and diverse group of constituents?
Absolutely. And I mean, when we were having these conversations on racial justice, I had people dialing in from Hong Kong. We have an office in London, and it's just very different in different places. So you're right. I mean, I think the first thing I do is I will use a word, and I will define it. So as an example, with the Black and white and the racial injustice, I say, I use that word Black, and I say, I understand that we have African Americans, we have Afro-Caribbeans, we have many people, students specific, definitely in all of our institutions who are African, who are here and will either stay here, but they are African, or they will practice in their home country. So it's broader than that. But in this particular instance, I'm using the word Black because none of those people will have the opportunity to have that conversation when they are pulled over by the police department. And so we're talking about that. And so as a mother of Black sons, when I have the conversation to make sure that their driver's license is right here in the middle console on top and not in their wallet, it really does not matter that we originate from Trinidad or, how long we've lived here or anything like that. So I try to put it in. Others that I have more trouble with, first of all, just because they change, like LBGTQ, is it LBGTQI? Is it LBGTQ? Do people get offended? I'll just ask the question. And sometimes it helps with the dialogue, and then bringing it back from the acronym and saying, what really matters there? Is it the belonging? Is it how people approach it? Is it the he, him, she, her? What are the things that we should be talking about? Because that's really where I want to get to. Same with POC. Okay, are we using POC, people of color, because we want to have statistics across diversity that are higher if we add certain populations and not others? Are we thinking about this issue the same across all of these? Like, is it an issue that really does affect, Asian women just as much as it affects Latin? Then we should be talking about people of color. But if that's not the case, if it's an issue that really only affects Black and brown people in this, then we should talk that way. And so a lot of it is as a leader, you're always afraid to say the wrong thing, but it's really peeling it back and asking people, well, what do you think? How do you think we should be using that word? And then there are some acronyms that I believe are used a lot of times to make things look a lot better than they are. I mean, I don't allow people of color in our bar graphs because, someone might have gone to Miami, gotten a tan. I want to know how many Black people, how many brown people, how many yellow people, how many Americans, American Indians. That's how I want to do it. But that's just so that I understand how much work I have to do. It's not to make people feel poorly because we don't have the right numbers, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think that does make sense. And I think it gets to the core of language. And we all know that language matters, but what is at the root of the language? And I think what you're saying is, let's dig down to what the issue is and focus on the issue, and then find the right descriptor to get us to where we need to be as regards change. So language is important, but you really have to know what the issues are behind the language.
Right. And, make sure you know the other side too, right? Because I've been throwing out Black and white for purposes of this conversation. If you think about white, and you read the history, right? I have noticed, because Chicago is known for all of these things. In 1922, Armenians were in court trying to determine whether they're white or not, right? People were not white just a couple of decades ago. They were Italian, Polish, Jewish, some of which dealing with incredible discrimination, right? And so part of it is, let's know our words, but then let's also make sure that we understand that we can have the broader discussion, and that takes the historical sort of data and knowledge. And once you do that, it really does open up it, beyond the us and them. You either, are diverse or you're racist. Like, that's just ridiculous. And so we have to fight those monikers a lot in order to have progress, in my opinion.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I have a quick question for you, because this comes up in organizations all the time. Are you a fan of DEI scorecards?
Yes, I would say yes. But only to our prior conversation, only to what end, right? And so if the DEI scorecards do a couple of things, if they drive not just numbers on the inside, but how people are evolving, as we talked about, through the organization. That's a good thing. And if people are spending more time really trying to drive diversity and inclusion versus trying to make the chart look pretty, which we get a lot of, and it's easy to do. Then yes. And if it has a direct business correlation to how we think about our student population base, and therefore whether we are being culturally sensitive and inclusive in the stakeholders that we serve, then yes. But I understand the impetus of your question. It's very difficult to have the focus be those things versus, like I said, I mean, you should see the charts when I started in this role. I'm like, I've never seen any Black people around here. So how are they on this purple bar graph? So I think as long as you hold people to the task.
Thank you so much, Lisa. We have such a short amount of time. And I just want to share that you have accomplished a lot in all that you have done. We are extremely proud of you. You don't strike us as someone who will rest on their laurels. My last question is, what's next for Lisa Wardell?
Yeah, so we are doing a big transaction now in our organization. Our belief is that the healthcare delivery system is rapidly changing and it's leaving behind diverse communities. And so I will be working on that for some time. There's at least 2 people on my board that want me to go into politics and drive diversity and inclusion and access that way. But I think for me, I can make the biggest impact in just really bringing on more women and more diverse women and more and helping people to get into those positions that really drive economic change in this country. Because at the end of the day, if we're empowered to serve customer communities, in our case, those customer communities are both students, but also large hospital systems, et cetera. There's just such a dearth of opportunities for large communities that we're kidding ourselves if we think that that's all just going to work itself out and we're just going to be able to be over here. So I think what's next for me is continuing to address those communities from the corporate perch.
This is really a historic time for change. I think the convergence of the multiple crises that we're facing right now really are a call to leadership. And Lisa, I want to thank you for sharing your secret sauce towards creating change and leading. This has been a very enlightening, albeit short, interview. We could probably talk forever. But at this point in time, what we would like to do is just thank you for this very insightful interview. And now we would like to move to our audience questions. We have Mari Watanabe, the Executive Director of Partners in Diversity, and she's going to help us moderate the audience Q&A. So audience members, I hope that you have dropped your questions into the chat. We have a wonderful opportunity to converse with Lisa Wardell and pick up some more gems of wisdom, experience, and insights into what it means to lead in a time of change, in a time of historic and great change. So with that, I'm going to turn the moderation over to Mari Watanabe.
Mari, we can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I guess my headset ran out of gas. So sorry about that. So thank you for sharing all those nuggets of wisdom. And it's amazing. And like you said, there's a lot of this is not new, but it is still, we must just keep going and helping our employers with diversifying and making their place a place where they feel like they belong. So one of the questions I have is about your onboarding program to foster inclusion. And you talked about it a little bit earlier. And so could you go into a little bit more detail? So when you talk about having access for new employees, are they just employees of color, or are they all employees? And then is it from the lowest levels all the way up that they get to meet? So can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Great question. So in terms of onboarding, it's all employees. We have a new employee welcome sort of week. I go in and now on Zoom, but usually in person, and speak and answer any questions people may have. We then have additional support for our diverse employees. And so we have affinity groups that just as many companies do, but we pair people with mentors. They don't have to be obviously the same gender or race or anything, but we pair our diverse new employees with a mentor to really help them navigate the organization. And then we have a more formal program. Usually you've got to, I think it's 12 months you have to be at Adtalem before you go into the program, because it does take time. You're sort of working on a project with a multifunctional group, and you do a presentation at the end. For that, it is any employee, but we make sure that there is at least 50% are diverse candidates, people of color. And then that presentation will go to my full team, some members of the board, et cetera, to get that exposure. And it's really proven quite successful for people to sort of see the other pieces of how the organization works. And it's from the very entry level all the way up.
Right. So you mentioned the mentor piece or even sponsor piece. So we have a question about that. So what do you have a formal sponsorship also, as long as, and you talked about the mentor, but you also have a formal sponsoring piece, and how does that work?
Yeah, so just my definition, a mentor obviously is somebody that you can go to ask for advice, somebody who's helping you navigate the organization. A sponsor is a little different in that a sponsor is someone who is willing to talk for you and about you, hopefully in a positive light, when you are not in the room. And so the way the sponsorship works for us is we have a really robust talent review process. It is year long. It's called Achieve 365 because literally it is open all year. We don't believe in the once a year, I'm going to tell you, Mari, everything that you did that I got on my nerves for the last year, because that's not helpful. Or all the great things you did all year. What I'm going to do is go into that system and say, hey, on this project, during this morning chat, Mari really was on top of it, made sure that whatever the case may be, and it's more consistent. And then we're really asking managers and managers to have a robust discussion about people so that we can better direct their next 12 months or so during the talent review process. And what we do is we not necessarily rank, but when people's names keep coming up, we say, okay, these top 15 people are, we try to limit it to 15 so that we can actually do something. We'll track that and say, okay, when did that person get their next opportunity? We all agreed that that person needs to be on a multifunctional team and understand a little bit more about digital marketing. Has that happened? And if not, why not? So that's how it works.
Great, thank you. So I had also kind of along those same lines. So, people come into your organization, especially people of color, and they get pegged as an emerging leader, possibly, or a great worker, right? There's kind of those layers, and so the people who kind of get pegged as that emerging leader kind of get the extra attention and help them move up the ladder. But from a cultural standpoint, some organizations that I know of that does leadership training, they really speak to that issue of, sometimes our cultural values get in the are probably not helpful in the corporate arena for moving up the ladder. So then those people end up looking like great workers and not emerging leaders. So how do you Do you have a way to kind of look past that, and or when you do development for your employees, how are you looking at it from a cultural standpoint?
Yeah, so I think part of the pitfalls get caught and rectified in the process I just talked about. But we do also make sure we have a very diverse HR group. And so that allows us to be able to sort of peel the onion a layer deeper, frankly, to make sure that it's not because someone is, I don't know, shy or reticent, or grew up culturally in a don't advocate for yourself, or whatever the case may be. And then we also do make sure that we have situations where I wouldn't say throwing people out there, but we're driving these exposures, but in a safe environment, right? So it's not 300 people that you don't know, but it's certainly helping kind of sort of weed that out and see what people not only want to do, but then also believe they can do, and if not, why not, and where do they want to be?
Thank you. Since George Floyd's murder happened last year, there has been a lot of shift within the corporate, and I think it's all good shifts, right? So, but I think the conversation piece is still a little bit scary and challenging for CEOs. So can you talk more about forums or formats you've used to really help encourage this dialogue, and then have they gone south? And then how do you keep it productive versus becoming a not a good situation? So.
Yeah, so we've done town halls, and we have had open Q&A just like this, and some of it has been, very, racially charged, particularly around that time frame. We started off with sort of videos of actual employees giving their personal story in terms of how they feel and see race, and see that through both company and personal. And then we've gone into Q&A, and in general, they have been well received, and they have been good. Again, the courageous folks, right, are the ones that are saying, well, they may not say it on the town hall, but I didn't like this or I didn't like that. And from that perspective, I make sure that I am personally responding to that. I obviously have a bit of a benefit in that I can speak as a Black woman. It's much harder, frankly, for my white male counterparts. I'm a part of the Business Council, which is 200 or so CEOs, obviously most of them white male, and I have to say, a lot of them do really struggle with how to have these conversations, and having the conversations there, as well as at the CEO for Diversity Action through PricewaterhouseCoopers, has really helped with those dialogues. But no, we haven't had any go off the rails, but we have had conversations and questions where I've said, I don't have a good answer for that. Let me go back, let me think about that, and let me come back to you with what I think is the best way to approach that, or the best answer, or something like that. I'm not afraid to do that in that kind of setting.
So we have one question on how can organizations structure messaging and the importance of diversity and equity groups and discussions to encourage the most participation and not inadvertently alienate those who think differently.
Yeah, I mean, that one's a tough one. We've always tried to have a topic. So as an example, we did the Harvard implicit bias quiz. We just sent it out to everybody in the organization, asked that people took it before they came in. And so there's sort of a structure. I mean, we also obviously give out books and things, or book titles and things like that, but that's harder depending on how much time people have, et cetera. But we try to have a subject matter attached to the town hall to sort of to kick that off. For us, we have a lot of PhDs that do work in bias within our institution. So being able to either take a paper or summary or something that they have, and that just kind of, give some structure to the conversation. And then the other is just pausing and making sure that you are, as the leader, whether it's me as the CEO or whoever's leading that discussion, is acknowledging that people have different viewpoints.
Yeah, definitely. We have a question about for you on being like the only Black female CEO. It's how do you what do you recommend for those who work in white male dominated fields who don't have someone like yourself to help pull them forward or help to pull other women of color forward?
Yeah, so I can answer that because I have been that person for much of my career. What I did was I put together a personal board of directors. Actually, a friend of mine recommended I do that. She had done that. And it's, 4 or 5 people who can't be a mama who's like, you're amazing. Or in the case of my mother, she's just like, what's your job? But in any event, it needs to be folks who understand sort of where you've been, where you're going, and have a real objective view on your skill gaps and your needs to sort of get to the next career progression. So it can be someone you've worked with before. You probably don't want it to be somebody who's in your current organization that's more of a mentor, somebody who knows you very well, somebody who has been watching your career. If you're earlier in your career, someone who knew you from college. If you're later in your career, someone who worked with you, 2 jobs ago. And just get 3 or 4 people and ask them, hey, what do you think the next opportunity or thing I should be thinking about within my organization is? Or, hey, the worst thing for me is when something happens and it doesn't happen to me as much anymore, but I don't react. And then like 1 o'clock in the morning for the next 2 weeks, I'm like, I should have said something to that person, right? When you have those moments, when someone asks you to pour coffee, when you walk into the meeting with your very nice suit and things like that. And you want a group of people that you can just say, this happened, help me process this, or how can I be ready next time? And, things like that. And that's helped a lot. I'll give you a real example. When I was new into the CEO role, I was on this panel and I would talk a lot in front of obviously my company, and people would ask me all the time, what are you going to do for women in Adtalem, and for women leaders, and for Black women, and for Black people? What are you going to do? I felt a lot of pressure, and I talked to one of the people on my board of directors, my personal board of directors. And he said, you tell them you're going to do the exact same thing that your white male counterparts do. You're going to make plan. You're going to make operating results. You're going to get the EPS that the market expects so that your stock can go up, which is what your investors expect. And then you're going to expect them to help you to be a good leader of color and a good female leader. And, that really helped me in developing what I was going to do. Not that I'm not here, obviously I take time to do things like this, but then to also help people remember. Until very recently, not very many people had to think about that. Just me and Marvin, Allison, and Ken Chenault, but not many other people.
Yeah. I saw some statistics like from just women of color, not just Black women on CEO roles, and it went up and then it went down because we had a couple retire, and that was a total bummer. Right. So even speaking of women on corporate boards, the statistics are really low. There is an organization out there called, what used to be called 2020 Women on Boards, and now it's changed to 50-50. So 20% women on corporate boards by 2020, which was last year. And I think they accomplished that. And then now they changed their name to 50% women on boards by 2050. And then now there's bills coming out, like California passed a bill, Washington State passed a bill, Oregon has one that's actually got a bill number pending. So do you think that this will really help move the needle, or is this something that should just be done because it's a good thing to do?
Yeah, look, I think that it ultimately what is going to move boards, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that organization, especially anything that's helpful for women to network. But what's ultimately going to move boards is 2 things. One is large institutional shareholder investor pressure. BlackRock, State Street, Fidelity, Vanguard, Citadel. And they are beginning to put that pressure on corporate, not even beginning, they're putting pressure on corporates. That's one. You know, not to sound draconian, but at the end of the day, you know, companies care what their investors think. They have to. It's how they continue to be market funded and invest and grow their business, and it matters. And the second is, frankly, again, a business need in and around understanding the consumer. We all know that the female is the consumer in the majority of households, et cetera, and more businesses are understanding that that's the case. But the reason it's different now is because you've got a woman or a Black person or a Latinx person on a board in much greater numbers because of this pressure that's happening, both to release data, right? So people are having to start releasing the data. There's now a process for doing that within in and around the ISS and Glass Lewis, the proxy advisory firms. And so that is going to create this change. What people don't really understand is that when boards are looking for a person, they're looking for specific skill sets and like they have gaps. They need someone that knows M&A. They need someone with a global perspective who's lived in, you know, Latin America. They need somebody who is really steeped in medical and healthcare from a delivery side, healthcare delivery side. They need somebody who knows e-commerce and has worked there and seen the disintermediation of Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. They need somebody. So the trick is making sure two things. One, that you're kind of on the pulse of what boards are looking for, and then requiring a diverse slate. We don't do executive searches for our board unless we require a diverse slate. That doesn't mean everyone on the slate is diverse. It means don't tell me you can't find anybody that fits any of these. And then we'll talk about the trade-off, right? And the second, I would say for this audience, for folks who may be a little earlier in their career, et cetera, some of you may, you know, pick that thing that you're just going to be really, really good at, right? It can be digital marketing. It can, in my case, it's finance. I like numbers. I always sit on the audit committee. No one ever wants to sit on the audit committee. If you do a board interview and you're like, I'll only join your board if you let me be on your audit committee, you're probably going to get on the board. Like, because no one says that, you know, just find your place and then make sure you like it. Like, you shouldn't do that if you don't like numbers, because audit's kind of boring for people who don't like numbers. But that's the push and pull, I think. I mean, I support all of these organizations who want to do it, but at the end of the day, it is a proxy advisor, large institutional investor and board initiative that's going to make this, and CEOs like me, it's going to make the change.
Yes, we need more CEOs like you, that's for sure. I talked a lot about some of the books that you mentioned that you read a lot of books. So did I. It's like all of a sudden that was like the thing. Everybody's watching more podcasts and reading more books and et cetera. So what are some of the books that you read or the podcasts that you listened to that really resonated with you and helped you even think differently?
Yeah, so Stamped and from the beginning and How to Be an Anti-Racist, clearly, Dr. Kendi. Caste by Isabel. I just love her anyway. Warmth of Other Suns is a great book by Isabel Wilkerson, but Caste is very, very good for that. Bias, I think Eberhardt is the author there, is one that's good. White Fragility is excellent. It really addresses the workplace and addresses it from the perspective of a white female and thinking through some of these issues. For sure. Let's see. I would recommend everybody either both watch and encourage people to watch 13, about the 13th Amendment. I think it's Netflix. The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, because those connections are both this whole notion of racism, and you can't just say I'm not a racist, it's anti-racism, and then the bias piece, but it's also this community and these communities that we have really impoverished post-slavery up to the present day, sort of the understanding behind that and why we find ourselves where we find ourselves. I think The History of White People by Nelville is an older book, but it is very helpful in this regard. And those can sort of give you a sense of why we are so polarized at this moment and what we need to do, to change that.
Yeah, those are all great. And in Oregon, I don't know if you know this, but we have a very racist history here in Oregon. For 67 years after we became a state, we were a white-only state. If you're a person of color, you can be here. So we have a long ways to go as well. But I'll just mention for our audience, the Oregon Historical Society did their winter quarterly journal in 2019 on Oregon's white supremacist history. So recommend you checking that out if you want to know more about Oregon's history.
You also do have great history, though. I also did read this summer Shoe Dog by Phil Knight.
Oh yeah.
So, but yeah, no question. And it's so fascinating, some of the states you wouldn't necessarily think of as you start looking at the stats, right? Certainly because we are more conditioned, like Florida, number one in lynchings ever in the history of the U.S. But some of us tend to think of Miami, or and so it's that fascination of understanding the broader history, which unfortunately you cannot. I don't think affect change in DE and I without understanding the historical notes. Oh, the other one is Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. That's an excellent book.
Oh, that's good too. Yes. I did have last question that came in. So do you have any guidance regarding gender identity education in the workplace as a part of creating a culture of diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, so I think it's very similar to the guidance that we've been talking about in terms of racial inclusion. And it is, well, two things. First, it's about listening and kind of transparency and the I don't know what I don't know perspective for sure. But I think the other is just even more because this area is changing so rapidly, and people are just afraid to not know the answers. That kind of setting the context of getting some people, and we have people in our organization that are happy to do this. Why do you have him, he, she, her on your email? Like, why is that important? Are there times when it's not important? What does this mean? How should I think about that? These are very new concepts for a lot of people. So there's two, unlike race, which is just okay, we're just going to pretend we're colorblind, and that all of this stuff happens by chance on the one side. On the other side, when we talk about gender identity, people just sort of distill that conversation into who can use which bathroom, which is just ridiculous, right? And so we've got to help people understand the broader discussion, and that's what we've tried to do at Adtalem. Not always easy, obviously, but
definitely not always easy. Thank you. Well, thank you, Lisa, for sharing this space with us and bringing so much practical and actionable insights, and just really could listen to you for another hour. And I want to also thank Dr. Davis White-Eyes for leading us in this important conversation. Did a great job. Thank you so much. So for you in the audience, I hope today's discussion will inspire you to go back into your workplace and start really making meaningful changes. And then lastly, please take a few minutes to send us your feedback. We like you to respond to our surveys, so very important to us. And so that survey link is being posted in the chat box. So thank you again, all of you, for being here today, and have a good rest of your day and rest of your week. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.